a.m. as we continue into the second half of today's edition of News and Views. And for a long time now, we've been talking about Cape Town, the cost of living in Cape Town, property costs as well. And to an extent, we've heard about the reason for the high cost of properties is on foreigners buying out property in Cape Town, and particularly looking at some of the luxury neighborhoods, the mountainsides, on the coastlines. We have heard about the Atlantic seaboard, and again, we've seen even the mayor, Jordan Hill Lewis, talking about foreign demand pushing up prices at the very top end. But an investigation that was done by the Daily Maverick actually reflects a different story, and there is a hidden story behind Cape Town's foreign property purchases. And we are now joined by award winning journalist Rebecca Davis. Rebecca, good morning to you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, when I read this piece, a very, very interesting piece, I must say, and there's just so much one can actually take away and digest, because for a long time we have been fed with the narrative that, the demand in Cape Town is great by foreigners, but wealthy foreigners coming from a number of countries right across Europe and many other countries, and particularly looking at the high-end market, those neighborhoods that obviously fall within the what we know as the Atlantic seaboard and some of the other areas. Just take us through this study or this investigation that was done, Rebecca.
So, people have said that something needs to be done about the fact that Cape Town's housing market is so expensive, obviously, that many of us are getting driven further and further from the city. And in response to this, the narrative from the mayor of Cape Town, Jordan Hill Lewis, and from the city has been that basically nothing can be done except that there's a lack of housing stock in Cape Town. Some people have said, well, can't we, put some kind of restrictions on foreigners buying property? And the mayor has said that is not the problem, because the foreigners only buy basically the most expensive properties in Cape Town. So they're not competing with locals, is the narrative we're being given. And I just felt intuitively that this could not be true, because, my son is at a government school in Cape Town, and there are so many white European kids in his class. This is a government school. And these people aren't living in mansions, they're living in flats, often in places like gardens or Oranjezis. These are places where ordinary Cape Townians do live. The problem is, though, it's very hard to find data on foreign property ownership, because it's not, the deeds office doesn't collect data on that. And some estate agent companies do, but they only give you very, very broad strokes. So on the suggestion of a reader, what I did was look at Airbnb data. Cape Town, as we all know, has a lot of Airbnb, 26,000 listings at least. And there is a project called Inside Airbnb, which scrapes all the data relating to these listings in major cities. So from that, I was able to get all the data for Cape Town and to filter it down by how many of the hosts are located overseas. This isn't necessarily that they always own the property they're letting out, but I tried to filter for that as much as possible by taking out people who are obviously property managers or letting companies acting on behalf of other owners. And still what I was left with was over 700 people based overseas. And I also, by the way, took out South Africans who just said in their listings that they were temporarily overseas. So these appear to be foreigners who own property in Cape Town that they then let out on Airbnb. And there was over 700 of them. And I think one of the most concerning aspects, I suppose, is that a number of them own many more than one property. In fact, the top 10 hosts that I looked at who are based overseas own 73 properties between them. The host I found based in Portugal, who had the most listings, owns 10 properties in Cape Town and lets them out. And these are not necessarily the wealthiest, the wealthiest neighborhoods, the most luxurious properties. I found, for instance, that some of them were owning one-bedroom flats around Cruise Street. These are flats that would go for 1.5 million, around that amount. I mean, that is an average Cape Town property price. In fact, it's on the lower end. So this idea that foreigners are only buying the best properties in the wealthiest suburbs is simply not true. I find evidence that a lot of them are buying now in places like Joburg, in the northern suburbs, in Garden City Bowl area, and even in one case in the traditionally colored fishing community of Hanga above Hout Bay. So this idea that they're just buying Clifton bungalows is just not true, it appears.
Yes. Also, Rebecca, I think what is important to understand is, this has been quite a comprehensive, detailed investigation that has been done. And, you speak about the Airbnb and the listings and who owns them, but also at the same time, in terms of property values in Cape Town, because talking to ordinary South Africans, I have a daughter living in Cape Town as well, and property has become unaffordable for many people that are living in Cape Town. And it's important to understand, through your investigation, the actual worth of these properties.
Yeah, I mean, the Cape Town housing market is, I mean, as a Cape Townian, I don't own a property myself, and I live in fear that my landlord is going to eject me at some point to turn it into an Airbnb. So there is this issue that it's increasingly unaffordable. As I said, these foreigners are not just buying top-end properties, they're buying properties that locals could. And we can also see that from the fact that even according to the estate agent company Lightstone, the average property purchase made by foreign nationals is now something like 2.7 million rand. That's a lot. That's more than the average person can spend. But it also means that because that's the average, it means that a lot of foreign owners are buying for substantially less than that. If you consider that they also are buying luxury properties, in order for the average to end up at 2.7 million, it means a lot of them are buying properties at more like 1 million, 1.5 million. And it's one of the reasons why the situation is unfair, because these are people buying in currencies that are much stronger than ours. And there are also stories about people taking out cash from bonds in their own countries for their original properties in order to buy in cash here to benefit from much lower interest rates in the country. So they are advantaged above locals on three separate measures: their purchasing power, their ability to access finance, and so forth. And it's increasingly untenable. Many people think that locals have to compete with that.
Well, certainly, and in fact, I'm just looking at the screen in front of me in terms of all the different countries as well, right across, and it does appear that many are across Europe as well. And I see the United Arab Emirates is also up there in that list. But Rebecca, just moving on, and I'd like to talk about. You've also, make mention in this article about the local economy argument. And this I find very, very interesting and fascinating in terms of the contribution to the South African economy. How significant is this?
Well, Airbnb claims that it's added 25 billion rand or something like that to the South African economy 2023. I'm not sure how they arrived at those figures. But certainly it is based on the assumption that their hosts in South Africa are local. And as my investigation found, this is not necessarily the case. So when you have a situation where you have foreign nationals buying up these properties very cheaply and then renting them out on Airbnb basically to other foreign nationals, that money is not going to South Africa. That money is going into this foreign national's bank account in a foreign currency in a foreign country. Airbnb doesn't pay tax in South Africa like Uber and all the other big tech companies. And so, yes, these foreigners who are coming to rent from other foreigners obviously are going to go out and spend money in restaurants and so forth. But the idea that it is like a hugely significant contribution to the economy is really open to question, especially because if you're a foreigner who owns an Airbnb, you're also probably going to come and stay in that B&B yourself rather than spending money on a hotel or renting from a local. So I think this narrative we're constantly being fed as well, that this is all amazing for the South African economy, is really actually quite questionable.
Rebecca, just finally, with this investigation, and I'm sure, obviously it's out in the open as far as the media is concerned as well. But it would be interesting to note, how the Western Cape legislature, the mayor, Jordan Hill Lewis, and the likes would actually respond to this investigation and some of your findings.
Yes, I too would like to know that. We sent them detailed questions and they didn't get back to us by deadline. Some of this, it should be said, is the remit of National Treasury rather than the Western Cape, obviously, to do with, property taxation and so forth. But there are measures that Cape Town could introduce. They could levy much higher rates on foreign purchases. And there are also suggestions that foreign property ownership needs to be capped at least at a certain amount of properties as a bare minimum, because this thing of property hoarding, where you can buy 10 different properties as a foreign national without even setting foot in South Africa, is really something that I think has to be addressed.
Well, Rebecca, we're going to have to leave it at that. But as always, we thank you. We do appreciate you taking time out for us here at Salam Media. All the best to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rebecca Davis, award-winning journalist and author, with us this morning. That brings us straight to 9:27. We come back. We'll be joined by independent researcher Mariam Juma Karichi.